Hello everyone, and welcome to the SIG CGI 2020 Blender tutorials. This is going to be my second set of tutorials that I've made for Blender, but this time will be for 2.8, the brand new version. My last set of videos were about 2.79, which is a very different Blender than the Blender we're going to be working with today. So this is the 2.79 UI, and that's the 2.8 UI. Everything changed, everything's in different places. It's a lot more user-friendly, which is good. It makes it a lot easier to get into Blender and a lot easier to get into CG art. So I'm excited to show you what's new. This is episode 0, where I'll be talking about what we're going to do over the series and showing you the 2.8 UI really quick before we get into episode 1. So the end goal of these videos will be to work on one project. And that project is taking this toad and fully realizing him in a fleshed out 3D model and 3D render. He's going to be beautiful. The only episodes that won't be talking about the toad are this episode, where I'm just talking about introductions, and the next one, which will be a more intro render, which will be froggy chair. Froggy chair will help us learn how to model simple geometry and like the very bare basics, because you can kind of see like basically every point on froggy chair. So froggy chair will be the level 1 easy intro stuff, and the final boss will be the toad. So episode 1, froggy chair, from then on toad, but for now it's just introductions. So Blender is completely free. Every software I'm going to be using in these tutorials to make any CGI is going to be completely free. Open source. I would definitely recommend supporting Blender if you have the funds. But if not, the download's free, and you can get it on any OS you want. I already have it downloaded, as you see here. And I'm also going to be using GIMP as my 2D photo editing. We need this because in order to make things like the face on the froggy chair, we need to unwrap the 3D model and put a 2D image on it. So we need 2D editing, photo editing software for that. So I use GIMP. If you have Photoshop installed, I would recommend using Photoshop instead of GIMP, but I'm not on Photoshop, so I will be GIMPing. And one last thing before I jump into the details is 3D art needs a mouse. There's been a lot of accessibility stuff added to Blender where it's like you can kind of get by without a mouse, but you can't really. It's just too hard. So I'd recommend following these tutorials on the mouse, and whenever you're modeling, use the mouse. Cool. So whenever you install Blender, I just installed Blender fresh, so this is like the setup page for Blender. And you have little options to play with, and I am very opinionated about these options, but you can choose them however you want. So the first one is selects width. Blender before 2.8 used to select with right, so just like if you're looking at a bunch of objects and you want to select one, you right click it. This is very controversial because every other 3D modeling software uses left click select. Most UIs in general use left click select. Like if I'm like on my desktop and like I want to select something, I left click it, right? So everyone likes left click. I'm the only right click fan in the world. I just use Blender 2.79 way too much, so I need right click. And then the second option is spacebar. So spacebar used to do search. So like you hit spacebar and you can type in like a command. If you don't know where like make a new cube is, you can do like search add cube. And they changed it recently to play, which helps animators animate. So you can easily like see what your animation is, press space, have it play out. I don't animate as much, so I'm going to keep it on search. Especially because there's a play button very clear, and search is like, I think F3 or some weird hotkey. I don't remember it. But yeah, I don't remember what tools is either. But the last choice is theme. So you can be light mode, which is disgusting. It looks kind of like old Blender, but not really. I'm normally a light mode fan in all of my programming software, but this new Blender is just looking too pretty. So this is just the splash screen for Blender. You get it whenever you open it. And this is the software. So I'm going to go through the UI clockwise from the top left. So starting up here, go around, and then kind of like inwards, and talk about everything that is important. So the top left is the title bar, which is the least useful title bar ever. I made this joke last time I talked with you, and I make it again. You use this at the very beginning of your projects and the very end of your projects. So you're like saving and rendering the final image. It's the only two reasons you'll ever use this top bit. And also editing user preferences. That's also pretty important at the start. If you have a keyboard that doesn't have a numpad, the numpad is actually pretty useful for Blender and 3D rendering. So you can press emulate numpad. I'm actually using a 60% keyboard right now, so it cuts off before the numpad, so I don't have the numpad. That's fine, because I can emulate the numpad with 1 through 9. So what that does is it moves the hotkeys from the numpad to the top keys, if that makes sense. Yeah. So that's preferences. There's also some other cool stuff you can do to customize your Blender experience if you want to. For future lessons, I'm going to be enabling an add-on called Screencast Keys. And what that's going to do is show on screen what keys I'm pressing for your learning experience. But it's the UI, so I'm not pressing any hotkeys yet. But I'm going to be doing a lot of hotkeys soon. So those will be down here when I enable it. Alright, so they added these layouts. They haven't added them. They've always been here. They're not in 2.79 actually. They were hidden in 2.79, but they're more obvious in 2.8. So if you see you press them, it switches how the screen looks. And I'm going to come back to that because I have a lot to say about the malleability of screens in Blender. And I have a big rant, but I'll get to that rant later. I'm going to explain some more stuff first. So moving right, we have this thing up here. This is the outliner. So it shows all the objects in your scene. Right now we have one collection, which is like a layer. Like in Photoshop, you have layers. In Blender, you have collections. So our collection has a camera, and that is when we render. This is what we'll see. A cube, the default cube, the beautiful, beautiful default cube, and a light, a little point light. So I can shift select, take all of them, open them up there. It's like a hierarchy. If you've used a game engine, it's very similar to how game engine hierarchies work. You can hide objects. That's very useful by like selecting them up here and then alt-Hing them. And yeah, collection is very useful to keep organized. You can rename anything. So a lot of time people end up with a very unorganized outline, and it just makes the whole rendering process or whole modeling process a lot more difficult. So I'll try and have the good habit of naming things up there. You should too. Alright, so down here is the most important part of Blender. This is the properties tabs. Some of them are very important. Some of them are important, but I won't talk about them in this tutorial because there's so much. And I'll start at the top. Well, I guess second to top. So this is the I think scene they call it. Yeah, render properties. So there are render engines in Blender. There's basically two that we're going to be working with, Eevee and Cycles. The difference between these two is that Cycles is older and meant for like not real-time rendering. So you see I move the screen around, it gets kind of fuzzy and then it gets unfuzzy because it's doing this path tracing every time I move the camera around. Cycles is better looking, and Eevee is good enough in budget. You can see I can swiggle around and there is no lag. So like for animations where you're just testing it live, you don't have to re-render it and spend 10 hours to see if you messed up, Eevee is the way to go. For like rendering a frame, if you want to like live edit it, then you can also use Eevee. But if you want to make it look more pretty, that's not very descriptive. If someone's actually very understanding of cycles in Eevee, they'd be very furious right now. My explanation. I'm trying to make it sense for someone who doesn't do much rendering. So hopefully that made sense. Eevee, real time, budget rendering, cycles, more in depth. So moving down, well, I guess I'll talk about sampling real quick. So when you render, this is basically how in-depth the render is going to go. I don't want to start rendering right now because the recording's going to lag, but 128 is pretty good for rendering. As you saw here, this 32, that's where this comes from. So I can upgrade that to 64, and see now it does 64 samples per render. It's basically how like far it's tracing the light and stuff per area of the screen. Alright, so moving on to output. This is like when you take out the render, like when I say take the image, this is all the details of that. So you can change the dimensions of the image. I just made my thing 1080 by 1080, so it'll be a perfect square. Before it was 16 by 9, 1920 by 1080. I can make it like whatever I want, and that's just useful for changing how you want the render to be. Like when I render for Instagram, I make it square. If I'm rendering to make the wallpaper, I'll make it 16 by 9. Simple stuff. View layers are important, and I will talk about them later. Mist is very useful. Freestyling, very useful. But we'll get to it. It's not important right now. The scene, also not important right now. The world. So world controls all of like the background aspects. So you see we have a background. I can change the background color. And then when I go to rendered, now the world's blue. Volume is like volume scatter. It's like sort of the ambient fog of the world. Ambient occlusion is just bare bones lighting that goes everywhere. It's just faking global illumination. So you can see light up everything a lot or light up everything a little bit. It's just to fake the fact that light bounces in the real world a lot. So there's basically a little bit of light everywhere at all times. Cool. Ray visibility, we might talk about, except for we won't. I take that back. Object properties has the holy trinity of geometry, location, rotation, and scale. So moving objects around, rotating them about, and scaling them. It's stuff most of us learned in 2nd grade and is very important for modeling. Most of the time we won't be using this menu, although this menu is useful if you want to do like exact mathematical equations. Like you can do math in this. You can be like 3 squared over 2. Oh, JK. You can't do squared like that, but you can do math like that. So for exact stuff like that, it's useful for putting it into this transform object properties thing. Otherwise, it's not that useful. But location, rotation, and scale are useful. It's just doing them per object is not so much. Doing it for like the vertices within the object, that's a lot better. So modifiers are so important. The little wrench is very, very, very important. It basically has a bunch of different stuff for modifying the existing geometry that you're modifying. I don't know if that made sense, but I'll show you. The most important modifier is subdivision surface. It's the first modifier everyone learns. It takes an object and splits it up so that it has more geometry. So I can turn up the amount of subdivisions, and you can see there's like a bunch of faces now when we really only ever made 4 points. So there's a bunch of modifiers like this that do various different things, and they are essential to modeling. So we will be coming back to the modifiers tab a lot. Keep it in your mind. Moving on, there's physics, which has a lot of cute little simulations of. I'll just do one right now. Make this a rigid body, make this a rigid body. Press play. It falls. So we most likely will not be using that, but it's just a nice tool in case you want to, excuse me, do any sort of physics simulation. As you can see, they have cloth, fluids. It's just a lot of stuff that's hard to model and easy to simulate. Like, for example, if I wanted to have a flag flying in the wind, like, that geometry is super complicated but can be simulated pretty easily. Alright, moving on. We're going to skip over this vertex groups and stuff for now, because we'll talk about that when we're talking about UV mapping. We're skipping over object constraints for now, because we won't be using those much. But materials. So this is color and texture control. There's actually textures down here. But this is changing the, basically it's the color and the texture and all of the light related data that's going into the object. So I just made it pink, as you can see. So some properties depend on the object selected. So for example, we have the cube selected, so we have this little material tab. The camera doesn't have a material, but it has a camera tab. And here you can change the different stuff about the camera, so you can like make it orthographic versus perspective, focal length, things that simulate a real camera, like depth of field. Then let's see, I gotta find the light. The light also has different properties. You can change the power of it. You can change the color it's emitting. I'll make it like a purple light. Yeah, you see there's a little purple there. And maybe make it orange emission. Beautiful already. Episode 0, we're making art. So I've been using the 3D viewport quite a bit. That's this main area. I don't expect you to know what I was doing, because I was just kind of going at it to show you what was going on in the properties tab. The 3D viewport's controls are a little confusing at first, but once you get them down, it just makes sense. So, if I middle click the mouse, see, this is why mouse is so important. You also want a mouse with a middle click. If you middle click, it rotates the screen around. I'll actually put this to Eevee so it looks pretty in real time. Yep. So, middle click rotates the mouse around. Shift middle click pans the screen. Scroll zooms. If you have right click select, then right click selects. If you have left click, it's left click select. My left click moves this 3D cursor. So the 3D cursor is like if you're adding an object, that's where it got added at the 3D cursor, and Shift C moves it back. I'm sorry, I realized that I actually am using a lot of hotkeys in this episode, and I don't have the screencast keys on. So hopefully you got all that. Middle click, rotate, shift middle click, pan, scroll zoom, right click select, or left click select. And that's the basic ways to move around the viewport. It's a little confusing to someone who like might play video games, because it's not video game controls. But it's very intuitive once you get used to it. And also, if you're like zooming and your mouse hits the right part of the screen, it just moves the mouse to the left part of the screen. So you can just keep going if you're going left and right. Alright, so starting in the top left of the viewport, there's the mode. So object mode is controlling whole objects. So like I'm moving this plane, or I'm moving this cube. if I press tab or open up edit mode, now I'm messing with the vertices of this specific object. So like I can move it around. I don't expect you to know what I'm doing because I haven't showed you it yet. I'll talk more about what I just did in the next episode. But edit mode adds the points. Object mode moves that whole object. The to the right of object mode and edit mode is this much more useful title bar. This I was doing like hotkeys, like Shift A for add, but add is just up here too. And this where you can add a whole bunch of like default objects, curves, text, images for reference, the cameras, lights. It's where you add objects. So I can add, for example, Suzanne the monkey. Have her chilling here. And then objects is a lot of object-specific settings you can do. So for example, shade smooth is something we're using a lot. It just does some shading tricks so that you don't see the vertices as obviously, while shade flat does. So there's a bunch of different little settings in the object tab up here that we'll be using. And shade smoothing is the most important one. Okay. So moving on. Oh, we have this top right bit. Well, I guess there's some stuff up here for edit mode. I'll talk about it a bit. So the most important one is proportional editing. So in proportional editing, or I guess I'll talk about non-proportional editing. In non-proportional editing, when you move a point, it's just moving the one point, right? Like nothing's moving relative to it. With proportional editing, I'm like distorting the whole face. So that'll be useful for moving geometry, like in general. Like I want to like make her nose stick out or something, right? And then transform orientations, I'll talk about at a later date. It's moving things in terms of what respect. I realized that I might have been blocking some of this stuff with my face when I was talking about properties tab. I hope I didn't cover too much. I don't think I did. I think everything was up here for the most part. So, top right, we have the different render options, which I was using Z to hotkey, but it's just up here. So this is wireframe. You see all the points. Solid, you're just seeing the objects. I think this works. You see the materials, but it's not rendering it. It's just showing like what the materials will probably look like. And then this is fully rendered. Yeah, it's material preview. So solid, wireframe, material preview, and rendered. The 4 viewport shadings. So in this area, this is where you can control the camera if you don't have a mouse. So like this is the shift click, this is the scroll, this is hitting 0 on the numpad or 0 on the keyboard. It brings you to the camera view. And then you can also rotate the camera around like this. I would not recommend using it. It sucks. It's useful for like switching to these like top, left, right, bottom views. But other than that, just learn the hotkeys, the mouse movement. So the last thing I want to talk about is how malleable Blender is. Blender is meant to be used like from beginning to end. You're just using this software and maybe some 2D software. So like you can see up here, there's modeling and sculpting and UV editing, and all those are different layouts. Now what they're doing is just moving the different screens around. So you can change any of these tabs to be whatever you want. The joke that I always make is that you can switch your viewport to be your outliner, and your outliner to be your viewport. So now, now we switched them around. You can make new tabs. You can switch the tabs that you need, and you can do this as your project goes on to have exactly what you need to be seeing at all times. So I wouldn't recommend even using these layouts because it's just changing the screens when you can do that yourself. Like for example, modeling is just the same thing as the basic layout, but the viewport is merged with the timeline. So to merge tabs, you just click on a bottom corner and drag it towards the one you're merging with, and boom, that is gone. And if you want to make one, you take the bottom corner and you drag it up. So I just made a new tab. By default, it's Viewport. I can, for example, do shader editing, and I could see this pretty little color shader that we have going on for the cube. And so it's this malleable workflow that we're going to be using a lot to kind of have the screens we need as we go. And if you accidentally ever make a new screen and you're panicking, which a lot of noobs do, just like start merging them down. Click on one, merge it down. Like, I remember when I was starting off, I would accidentally like mess up my UI and I'd be so confused. But it's actually got even easier in Blender 2.8. You can just select any corner and drag it in. So that was the UI. Hopefully that made some sense. It'll make more sense as you begin to use it. I recommend downloading Blender, checking it out, also downloading GIMP if you have the chance, manipulation program, and get ready for the next episode where we'll be making Froggy Chair. And I'll be using Froggy Chair as a tutorial on how to use all of these cool edit tools at our disposal, which besides just translate, rotate, and scale, have a lot of potential to make any geometry you could ever imagine. Catch you next time.